MakeReal specialises in creating immersive learning solutions across a range of technologies. To download their latest academic paper on how to turn learners into activists, visit makereal.co.uk/activists.
Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning. In this highly acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark, internationally famous author, blogger and entrepreneur, joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of thought and theorising about learning from the Greeks to the geeks. This episode covers a sizable sweep of history from the perhaps misnamed Dark Ages and the Islamic Golden Age on through the Renaissance, Reformation and Enlightenment. As the Christian and Islamic faiths spread, learning became a powerful tool of religion, and religious educators in their turn changed the shape of learning.
So welcome to this episode of Great Minds on Learning on the subject of religious educators. And welcome to Donald. Donald, last season we did an episode on religious leaders, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad and the rest. This time it's religious educators. What's different about this group from the former? Give us an overview, please, of the theorists we're covering this time.
Sure thing, John. So we had a program on the Greeks, and they were terribly important. And we had a program on religious leaders, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, and Confucius, a sort of quasi-religious leader. So they were two sort of origin stories or foundation steps. But of course, there is this vast period up to the Reformation, which is sometimes called the Dark Ages. But there is a sort of, golden thread from those two deep origins, those big tributaries, a bit like the Nile, the blue and the white Nile coming together to form a post-Reformation world and ultimately the Enlightenment. So across that period, the sort of thread, as it were, we've had a towering figure in St. Augustine in 4th century AD, who really is a bridge who brings Christianity and Plato together. So he's a Platonist, but he's a towering figure in learning theory because his two books, and I have his two books here, The Confessions is an absolutely fantastic, quite racy sort of book for its time, 4th century AD, remember, and then his massive 1,100-page City of God, which is his magnum opus, philosophical work, really. But he brings religion and the Greeks together, namely Plato, and writes extensively on education, and we'll come to him in a moment. Then we, of course, will touch upon the Arab world because in the 11th and 12th century in Damascus, Baghdad, these centers of learning, and they are the people who act as a bridge from the Greek world. So we have lots of Greek texts, especially Aristotle into Aquinas and so on. And so they're a bridge into ultimately the Renaissance and the Reformation as well, because a lot of this classical secular knowledge comes through these people. And then we have the battle royale in the Reformation. We have the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. The two big figures there, of course, on the Protestant side or the Reformation side are Luther first and then Calvin. And then we have Ignatius, the Catholic Counter-Reformation figure who comes just after them, but it's contemporaneous with Luther, but really consolidates the solid background in Catholic teaching, which comes really through Aquinas, through the Jesuits, and dominates South America and those areas of the world that have Catholicism as their basic belief state. And then there's a really lovely figure afterwards, Comenius, who I really love, because as you emerge from printing and the Reformation, you have somebody who lays the foundation. He writes the first textbooks, amazing books. They really are they're all free on the internet. They're worth looking at. But he really consolidates in a practical way that idea of universal schooling and pansophism, the idea that there is universal knowledge for everyone, rich and poor, anywhere in the world, a sort of global view of learning. So an interesting thread that comes through to the Reformation and sets us off towards the Enlightenment.
Okay, lots to cram in. Let's get going. So Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 43 O, also known as Saint Augustine, was a theologian and philosopher of Berber origin and the bishop of Hippo Relgious in Numidia, Roman North Africa. His writings influenced the development of Western philosophy and Western Christianity, and he is viewed as one of the most important church fathers of the Latin Church in the patristic period. His many important works include The City of God, which you were flashing around there, so impressed with the size of that book, on Christian doctrine, and of course his famous Confessions, a work of spiritual autobiography, perhaps the first work of spiritual autobiography, weaned off an early interest in Manichaeanism by Neoplatonism. He underwent a conversion to Christianity, the faith of his mother Monica, partly through her influence, but also that of St. Jerome. He wrote prolifically and spent a lot of his adult life in polemical disputation, which I know you like to do a little bit of, Donald. Highly relatable for his admission in the Confessions that it's not at all easy being good. Massively quotable and misquotable. Famous quotes include, "Lord, give me chastity and continence, but not yet," used by many an erring cleric in public life. Also quoted in The Wasteland, "To Carthage then I came, burning, burning." Donald is a huge figure in culture, a church father who atheists like to read too. But what's his importance for learning?
Yes, it's often missed out, this, but if you read the Confessions, which is a fantastic book, I remember this is the 4th century AD, because he tackles his own learning. What was school like for himself, And he hated school. He was one of those kids who really loathed what he had. He loathed being taught in Greek, which, of course, it was later Latin, but similar thing, a classical language of teaching. Then he hated that sort of memorization, rote learning stuff, and also mentions the sort of punishment, almost the culture of punishing people whenever they made mistakes in school. So the whole culture of ignoring the learner, everything was teacher-driven and quite brutal, is really amazing in the book itself. The book, it is almost a lesson in how not to teach and how not to motivate learners. But the book is interesting as well because it's soaked in, of course, his self-loathing over the sins he committed when he was a young man. So he has an affair with an unmarried woman who he has a child with. And so it's all about lust and him stealing things and, that sort of wild teenage years that he had. Mm. So he has all these negative experiences as a youth, as a learner in school, and then turns his attention a wee bit later, actually, in another book called The Teacher. And then there's another book called the Catechisandus Rudibus. And both those books actually attend to teaching and learning. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of detail in there. And it really is amazingly modern, this notion of encouraging, really talks a lot about intrinsic motivation. Encouraging curiosity, getting rid of all that punishment, the technology of punishment, as it were, and that attitude that you have to beat people into submission to learn. And also a lot about teachers. The book, The Teacher, is about planning lessons. It reads as if it's right off the shelf. Now, planning lessons, the teachers have to themselves learn how to teach. It's a sort of practice, which many teachers, of course, would agree. Anyone who's tried it would know this. And also be ultra sensitive to the nature of the learner. And this is the first time you really see this in a big way. That sensitivity towards learners he expresses in a lot of detail. And in many ways, he's saying teachers might be the problem here. This overbearing, didactic view of the world, often in his time driven by religious zeal, but maybe that's the wrong way. And he talks in very eloquent terms about a restrained style of teaching. In fact, he has these sort of almost like teaching styles, and not fashionable these days. But he talks about a restraint, the simple, keeping things simple, very direct for the learner. He then says that you have to adapt your teaching style up into what he calls a mixed style, where you're elaborating more. You're giving more. You're trying to motivate the learner into being more autonomous. And then the grand style, which he describes as really changing hearts and minds. That convincing last push. Where you get people on board of whatever you're trying to teach. So it's all about motivation. That's a really important thing for Augustine.
So some strangely familiar things.
Yeah, incredibly contemporary. Almost astonishingly so. I mean, you have to wait really until the Enlightenment, almost, I think, 1300, about 1300 years later, until you get people like Locke and so on, Mary Wollstonecraft and so on, who really reflect a lot on motivation and the nature of the learner and learning. And of course, Rousseau. Rousseau was a great fan of St. Augustine, by the way. So I think we have, you have that link, but you have almost an echo of what's to come in the Enlightenment in these writers.
Well, our listeners only have to wait about half an hour till we get to the Enlightenment. Let's go to, I have to apologize in advance for my terrible pronunciation of Arabic. I've no knowledge of how to do it, really, so I'm pretty much guessing here. Al-Ghazali, 1058 to 1111, that's a very easy death date to remember, was a Persian polymath known as one of the most prominent and influential jury consults, legal theorists, muftis, philosophers, theologians, logicians, and mystics of the Islamic Golden Age. He had a lot of range and was actually criticized by that. You're a Sufi to the Sufis, you're a this to them, you're this to those people. Born in Iran, he taught theology and philosophy in Baghdad. Al-Ghazali believed that the Islamic spiritual tradition had become moribund and wanted to renew it, and that spiritual sciences taught by the first generations of Muslims had been forgotten. This led him to write his magnum opus entitled The Revival of the Religious Sciences. Outside the Muslim world, he influenced many thinkers, including William James and Thomas Aquinas. Donald, how should he influence us to think about learning?
Yes, well, there are a number of Arab scholars who act as a bridge from the classical world. So these, the great centers of learning in Damascus and in Baghdad, and Cairo, he's based in Baghdad, but these are writers who have Plato and Aristotle and Christian scholars as well at their fingertips in their libraries, and they're writing a scholarly works themselves. He is unique in that in his The Rescue from Lost and the Revival, 2 books, he actually addresses the whole teaching and learning thing. So it's not just about how to live, a good religious life under the submission of Islam. It's also the important role of teaching and learning in that context. So unusually, some may say, but it doesn't surprise me in the slightest, that, you have this rich tradition in Baghdad at the time of critical thinking, which is often odd in what some would regard as a dogmatic religious context. But the role of reason and logic and critical thinking, all the things that we sort of respect post-Enlightenment. Of course, Islam didn't have a Reformation, but it was there then in those earlier days in Damascus, and more importantly, Baghdad, I think. So teaching and learning, you must remember that this was about Islam, and was about moral purpose. That was the primary role of the teacher. But it's interesting. One of the things I like him, he talks about humility. I actually had a day with Julian Stodd recently, who's written a book on humility and learning, and it had lots of echoes of these Arab scholars. They talk about the humility that a teacher must have, humility and honesty. It's not about pulling the wool over the eyes of the learner. It's about bringing yourself to their level and engaging in critical thought with the learner. So a really interesting figure.
We could say a lot more about him. We do have to scurry along now to Ibn Tufayl, 1106 to 1185, born near Granada in Spain. So interesting, we started with St. Augustine in North Africa. We then went to Persia, Iran, and now we're in Andalusia, which is the kind of the bit of Spain where many people go on holiday, which at that time was in charge. The Arab world was in charge of that. So he was an Andalusian Muslim polymath, another polymath, writer, philosopher, theologian, physician, astronomer, and vizier. Most famous for writing this extraordinary book, the first philosophical novel, I'm going to have trouble with again, Hay Ibn Yaddan, translated as The Living Son of the Vigilant. I've seen some very different ways that this title is translated, but let's go with that for now. The Living Son of the Vigilant, a major work of Arabic literature in which an autodidactic feral child raised by a gazelle and living alone on a desert island discovers ultimate truth through a systematic process of reasoned inquiry. Possibly, and quite probably, I think, the inspiration for Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. There are a lot of points of plot correspondence in that book. It also contains pre-echoes of Caspar Hauser and things we read in Rousseau. It's not completely outlandish to think that Defoe is inspired by this, because it was a bestseller throughout Western Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, and influential on a whole host of blokes in wigs, including Leibniz, Voltaire, and many other Enlightenment figures. Donald, he was a critic of Al-Ghazali. How did he move the understanding of learning forward with this wonderful book?
Yes, as you rightly say, I think he almost certainly was the inspiration for Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Although it's a sort of funny way, a sort of more deeper and reflective book than Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe, famous Scot, is based, of course, on the famous true story of Alexander Selkirk. I was there recently, actually, in Lower and Upper Largo, which is where this guy was born and went back to live. That's Alexander Selkirk. But his book is interesting because it's related to the learning theory as well. The book is a bit like Rousseau's Emile. So you're describing the person who learns themselves because he's isolated. There's no one to draw upon, but gets an understanding of the world he exists in, the universe, and of course God. It's fundamentally still a religious text through their own efforts to learn from themselves. Now, what he does though is quite interesting, because he also makes this big distinction between logical sort of reasoning learning and intuition. It's a bit like Daniel Kahneman's fast and slow thinking. Yeah. So you have this, normally we just in a rush, we're thinking intuitively, we have all these biases, and that is tempered by our logical reflection on well, hold on a minute, is that true? What do the numbers say? What does the data say type idea? So he's in this sort of Neoplatonist tradition like St. Augustine as well, but in an entirely different context. But he also brings in, this time, of course, Aristotle is coming through the Arab scholars, and Aristotle comes through into the Catholic Church via Aquinas in this period. So, these are really important springboards or bridges into the Western world from the Arab world, a bridge, curiously, from Greece to Baghdad back into Europe again, which then goes on to the Renaissance and ultimately the Reformation and some of the figures we're just about to discuss. Okay,
let's move on. It feels like a lightning tour. There's so much more to say about these people, but we have to get going.
It's a long period, of course. We're really what we're covering something like 12 to 1300 years here. So
absolutely, yeah.
Long time.
So Ignatius of Loyola, 1491 to 1556, a fancy dresser, an expert dancer, a womanizer sensitive to insult, and a rough, punkish swordsman who used his privileged status to escape prosecution for violent crimes committed with his priest brother at carnival time. This was how a contemporary described the aristocratic Basque soldier Ignatius at 17. However, his military career was cut short by a cannonball at the Battle of Pamplona, which shattered his right leg. And it was while recovering from that surgery that he underwent a spiritual conversion and was called to the religious life and became a very different person. The theme of dramatic conversion runs right through a number of these people. Nevertheless, when with friends, including Francis Xavier and Peter Faber, he founded the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits, it maintained a pronounced military character. It's been popularly known as God's Soldiers or the Company. Interestingly, a nickname also used at the CIA. And you could look at the Jesuits as being an analogous organization to the CIA in world history. I know, as a Catholic, ex-Catholic, I have a lot of anecdotal stuff about the Jesuits I'm not going to go into because we don't have time. The relevance of this man to education ought to be obvious just from his famous quote, "Give me a boy until he is 10 and I'll give you the man." How many people are going to give over a 10-year-old boy to Catholic priests nowadays? I don't know. And from their founding to the present day, the J's, as they're also known, have always placed a huge emphasis on education. But Donald, how significant was the legacy of Ignatius in the development of learning?
Well, yeah, we're about to hit the Reformation, and we'll deal with Luther and Calvin in a moment, no doubt. But of course, people sometimes forget we have a counter-Reformation. So Ignatius is really a Reformation figure as a counter-revolutionary, almost as a founder of the Jesuits, of course, whose famous phrase was "Go set the world on fire." In Latin, "Ita inflammate omnia." So at that point, remember he was born, as you say, 1491. Columbus hits America, 1492. South America and that colonialism from Portugal and Spain spreads throughout the southern hemisphere, taking Catholicism and education with it. So he not only founds the Jesuits, but he writes the Jesuit constitutions, and which have a very strong educational feel to them. He's saying that the real weapon in terms of the spread into remote locations by these zealots, these defenders of the faith, was going to be the process of schooling and education. But it was quite, more enlightened than, the famous phrase, of course, is the one you mentioned about, give me the boy until he's 10, I'll give you the man. But actually, there was some quite liberal aspects to this education that we shouldn't forget as well. Mm-hmm. They were quite keen on not only teaching in Latin, which they did, but also the study of native languages of the students were important to the teachers. Things like history, mathematics, geography, the arts even, and drama, which they got from classical knowledge, of course, the Greeks, and the natural sciences. So he was an important figure in that side of the equation as a counter-Reformation figure. But there was also a little bit later, you have the Constitutions, the Society of Jesus, that really, he's saying that you have improvements in living and learning for the greater glory of God and the common good. That's in the Constitution itself. But you then, towards the end of the 16th century, you have the Ratio Studiorum, which is really like a manual for teachers, a manual which decides how the Catholic Church will teach in South America, in the Philippines, and across the world. That, interestingly, was updated as recently in 1986 as characteristics of Jesuit education. This is still a massive educational movement globally. Hundreds of schools, even universities and so on. But they have always had a sort of Jesuit educational manual. It's been the Ratio Studiorum was written by not Ignatius himself, by a guy called Aquaviva, but that has been the core. It's almost like a religious syllabus with loads of secular stuff in it, the Jesuit educational manual, because ultimately it's a tool of the Catholic Church, of course. Yeah. But what's interesting, I think, is this notion that includes the arts, includes drama, physical education, critical thinking, all the sort of things that we regard as secular. But they were, to be fair, they were in Catholic education right from the beginning in the Counter-Reformation. I mean, Latin was compulsory, and that's one side I don't like about this, because that just is still ridiculous that we should be talking about a modern curriculum that teaches Latin, in my view. That's just, I think, almost idiotic and absurd, because it doesn't help people learn other languages. All the evidence shows that all those arguments are a waste of time, really. But I think, Ignatius's influence on modern day education is still here, especially in the US, where really the Loyola schools are part of the mainstream educational landscape still. There are plenty of them, hundreds of secondary schools. I think it's about 50 countries that they're still in. Dozens and dozens of higher education establishments as well. Yeah.
It's good you emphasize the richness and broadness of the type of education that Jesuits gave. They kind of turn up everywhere in 20th century literature, and any kind of author who wants to take a broad sweep of culture, they seem to get into. So they're kind of in Evelyn Waugh. There's a long, exhaustively combative series of debates in Thomas Mann's book, The Magic Mountain, between a Jesuit and an Italian revolutionary, that occupy most of the second half of the book. It turns up in Pension. You have Jesuits. I could go on and on. But,
Yeah, but
it's such an interesting organization, I think.
Yeah, I think that's to do with there is this view that the Reformation absolutely succeeded, which in a sense it did, but not wholly.
Yeah.
In culture there was the Counter-Reformation, and that's still alive and kicking. I've just given you some of the stats around that. And if you go to other cultures in South America, especially, but in other parts of the world, you find that the European concept of a post-Reformation world is not as certain as one might imagine.
Yeah.
So that battle is still ongoing. And of course, the religious wars that ensued for hundreds of years after the Reformation meant that continued and is still there in Northern Ireland, in Belgium, which is split, in Holland, and all sorts of places where you have this clash between the post-Reformation and Catholic counter-Reformation cultures. Okay. Southern, Northern Europe split to this day.
We hope this podcast ups your knowledge about learning. But did you know learning podcasts, that's audio training created according to evidence-based principles, is a powerful and fast-growing medium? Assemble U is an audio-first provider with a ready-built course library to help your people improve productivity, leadership, well-being, and more in their downtime. Assemble U also creates audio courses unique to your company or institution. Try it free today at assembleu.com/greatminds, all one word. So we've slightly got ahead of ourselves because we've done the counter-revolution before before we've done the Reformation. So let's correct that breach now, and we'll talk about somebody who's very well known, of course, Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546. Luther was a German priest, theologian, author, hymn writer, professor, and Augustinian friar. He's the seminal figure of the Protestant Reformation, whose followers became known as Lutherans. Although I had a Catholic mother, my father was brought up in the Lutheran faith, pretty roundly rejected it. The story is almost too well known to bear repeating. The nailing of his 95 theses to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, which might or might not actually have happened. The Diet of Worms, which of course I found excruciatingly amusing when we studied it at school and sniggered at that title, and his subsequent excommunication by the Pope. Excommunication in those days was a really serious thing. It meant that anyone who wanted to kill you had impunity. Donald, his original quarrel with the church was all about indulgences, and on the face of it, a fairly obvious corrupt practice that surprised it couldn't be more easily rooted out. But the changes he actually brought about went far deeper than that, and down to the very basic tenets of the faith, transubstantiation and so on. But to what extent did the way he changed Christianity change learning?
Yeah, so I really feel this one in the same way that you were brought up in a Catholic tradition, John. I was brought up in more of Calvinist, less Luther was more Northern Europe, but Scotland through John Knox was really a Calvinist tradition, but know this culture well. This culture of it's just me, just you, the good book and God, forget the priesthood, forget ritual, forget church, as it were. That's secondary. And this is why it has huge consequences in terms of learning and learning theory, and also heralds in printing and the more secular form of education. But yes, it was far more than just, indulgences, a bit of an indulgence. It was really about a much more deep-seated view of the individual in relation to religion, but also the world at large. Suddenly, Christianity embraced the idea that learning and schooling was a good thing. Knowing about the earthly world, as it were, as opposed to the heavenly realm only, was a very positive thing. So Luther is unique because he actually writes books, 2 big books on education. And they've got really weird titles. It doesn't sound as though they're a very educational book. The first one was addressing the mayors and aldermen of the cities of Germany. It's actually called that on behalf of Christian schools. It's got schools in the title, where he's recommending that the country, not really a fully formed country then, quite a federal sort of loose state, he's recommending that they introduce universal schooling. And then a second book, The Duty of Sending Children to School. The duty of sending children to school means that it's a religious imperative that we put scripture and Christian belief in the hands of the people, and that they must understand and read scripture directly in their own language. So you have this notion of both a spiritual and civic education. That might be a better way of putting it. In the mayor's book, he's addressing all these town councillors and so on. But he quotes directly from scripture itself, from Psalms and Deuteronomy, saying, listen, the book itself says you should do this, in the same way that Islam has a sutra that talks about using writing in education as well. It's God's command that you do this. But he focuses on the state. He's a good politician, Luther. He says the only way I'm going to get this done is not through the church or the Reformation, because we're actually burning almost everything that exists in churches and dismantling the church and the priesthood. So he turns his attention to schools, and schools for everyone, the rich, the poor, the sacred or the secular. It doesn't really matter for him. And so you suddenly have the emergence of this Renaissance notion of still the classical curriculum. He draws heavily on that. He doesn't really deviate much from it. But we have a German Bible, of course, with printing. And then he does actually reflect on the fact that no matter how much he tells the state to do this, he actually fails. It doesn't work, which is why his second book, The Duty of Sending Your Children to School, is actually more directed at parents, saying you have a spiritual and religious duty and imperative here to help educate your children. This is quite unusual. This is universal schooling. The idea had never really arisen before. It's very much a thing which the elites did. So suddenly we have universal education and schooling as part of, it was a form of reformation. It was part of it, an intrinsic part of it, because you had to allow people to read scripture directly, to be literate, to study and understand it. And And at this point, we'll get to Erasmus, but at this point, education is not purely an end in itself. That's an important point. Education is still a religious imperative, but it has a much wider definition, and universal schooling is terribly important. And of course, his influence is massive, especially in Northern Europe, and of course, through immigration into the US and Australia. There's still big Lutheran communities in those places.
Would it be too crude to say that perhaps his biggest long-term influence was in this type of disintermediation, as we'd call it nowadays, that it was direct engagement with the text, with the word as it comes down in the Gospels and so on, without a priest in the way. In other words, before there'd been this kind of rather hierarchical thing about church, that the secret truths of Scripture were there in a way to be hidden from the people who weren't clever enough to understand it. But Luther says no, the way to faith and to grace is through direct contact with the Word of God, and that also went along with a big kind of freeing up with the Mass and Bibles and so on in vernacular languages, a change in the way that the priesthood was configured and so on. Big changes in society as well.
I think that's a really important point here. We have to remember the role in which technology played in all this. My book I've got here somewhere, Learning Technologies book, this one here. I have a whole chapter on printing as a learning technology, because that was part and parcel. Great word you used there, disintermediation, John. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's exactly right. But the disintermediation was enabled by the fact that you have at the same time Gutenberg and printing. And so you had this amplification through books into the general population, especially through schools and schooling. So it becomes a sort of Cambrian explosion, not only of religious texts, which is what Luther was hoping for, but also secular texts.
Yeah.
And therefore, of course, you have this trajectory that's created, the sort of escape velocity on the back of printed books towards the Enlightenment. But disintermediation it's almost a synonym for the Reformation, isn't it?
Yeah. So let's press on with another famous name of the Reformation. John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, was a French theologian, pastor and reformer in Geneva during the Protestant Reformation. We don't say Switzerland because Switzerland didn't really exist then. You had, I think, nation states. He was a principal figure in the development of the system of Christian theology, later called Calvinism. including its doctrines of predestination and of God's absolute sovereignty and the salvation of the human soul from death and eternal damnation. I'll be honest, when I was first exposed to Calvin as a Catholic adolescent in a C of E school, I found him intensely unlikable. So I'm not going to say too much more about him, other than he clearly belongs here because he saw himself more as a teacher than a clergyman. And reading your blog post about him, Donald, it's clear that you see his influence as a curse as much as a blessing for learning. Actually, earlier when you were talking about St. Augustine and the way that he kind of freed up the idea of the way that you should learn, it kind of feels like Calvin is bringing all the bad stuff back in. It's getting very punitive. So tell us about Calvin, the blessing and the curse.
No, you're absolutely right there, John. So Calvin is really a direct line from St. Augustine theologically. That's an important point, if not in learning theory. So you have the concept of predestination, which of course is actually invented almost by St. Augustine. And that, just to remind ourselves of the doctrine that God has eternally chosen those who he intends to save. Very different from the Catholic Church, where you have to earn your right to be saved. Yeah. And then, of course, this original sin idea, from Adam and Eve. Now, this affects the educational theory of Calvin, because the original sin idea is that everyone has this, your starting point is a deficit. God, I know this culture. I said word God there, but if we take it both ways. I know this culture so well because it was the schooling that I was brought up in, one where corporal punishment was commonplace. I remember getting slapped over the hands with huge leather straps and so on. It was deeply and repulsively Calvinist at times, the schooling I was brought up with. And of course, at the same time, all the Catholics in my town, I never knew any Catholics until I went to university. They were all bussed off to another school. So the Reformation, Counter-Reformation is still with us. So you're right, direct line back to St. Augustine. But again, like Luther, he sees school as a form of secular salvation. So universal schooling is much more important than Calvin was a much more important figure than Luther in this one. And Illich, in his great book on deschooling, describes Calvinism as having literally created modern schooling, shaped it. As the schooling we know today is essentially a Calvinist construct. And again, it was this idea of a religious goal, understanding God through scripture, get rid of all that ritual that the Catholic Church had imposed upon people, and almost trying to dispense with Latin as the main form of instruction and working in vernacular languages. But his fight against sin was always there, this deficit model. You have these, in Scotland, there's a very famous figure, John Knox, who was a huge political figure, but that idea of castigating, going back to our program on the sermon and the parable, well, this was more teaching as preaching. This was pulpits. This was moral instruction. You will sit and listen, and if you don't, you will be punished because you are sinful. Nevertheless, the good side of all this, if there's a good side at all, is universal education from a very early age, which Calvin was the first to say, no, we should start this, much earlier than we ever imagined before. And there was this huge encouragement for the building of schools. And importantly, free schooling for everybody, especially the poor. The idea was to democratize schooling and education away from the rich towards the poor. And in Scotland, for example, John Knox pushed for a school in every parish, and that happened very quickly. The good side of this in Scotland is you had the literacy levels in Scotland during and after the Reformation rose to be the highest in Europe. And some reckon that this was one of the big causal factors behind the flourishing of the Enlightenment in Edinburgh and Glasgow at that time, the famous Scottish Enlightenment with, the figures we know that, Hume and Smith and so on. But there, again, going back to the point we made earlier, he's also a big promoter of publishing. This is what, we suddenly have publishing exploding across Europe, into the UK, into Southern Europe, and being spread very quickly around the world. So Knox in Scotland, for example, writes a book called The Book of Discipline, which is like a blueprint for a national system of education in Scotland, which did actually happen, based on that individualist, just you, the good book, and God. So what he does is set in motion, almost accidentally, a secular movement in education, free schooling, universal schooling, but tinged with a sense of punishing learners in order to get them to their learning goals. And it's only recently, in my book on learning technology, I have a whole section on the technology of punishment. It was an astonishing bit to research that, from the Romans onward, but especially post-Reformation, you have all sorts of bits of technology, whips and paddles and leather straps to beat people, and whips, even canes in the public school system to beat pupils into submission. One might think that has gone, but it hasn't. There are still places in the world where that happens, but that was the downside of Calvinism. But I think the benefits outweigh the deficit model.
Of course, we shouldn't make out that the Catholic system of education was really any better than that when it came to punishment. The people who were sent off to be punished by the Christian brothers would have a tale or two to tell about that, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's worth picking up on as well, because what you have with Ignatius, and you have that very strong streak that comes through Southern Europe, sort of witch hunting type view of the world. But even the Catholic Church picks up on this Calvinist streak, especially in schooling, and it becomes a hell of damnation. It's a place of horror for some kids, of course, as it still is, I'm sure. But thankfully, I think we're emerging the Enlightenment had very little effect on this. It carried on until the 19th and most of the 20th century as well. We're only now reflecting on how bad this really was in terms of motivation and learning.
So moving on, Desiderius Erasmus, mostly just known as Erasmus, 1466 to 1536. That had contradictions. A priest who was born out of wedlock, quite possibly gay, that certainly wrote against what it saw as sinful homosexuality. A reformer who nevertheless stayed within the church all his life. So he's part of the Reformation, but perhaps a progenitor of it, but actually stayed within the church. The prime mover behind the Reformation, according to some, Erasmus laid the egg, it was said. Luther hatched it. However, Luther called him a viper, a liar, and the very mouth and organ of Satan. Didn't hold back, Luther. No. Erasmus was a Dutch philosopher and Catholic theologian who is considered one of the greatest scholars of the Northern Renaissance. He was in his time incredibly famous for his learning. He was sort of friends with everyone all over the place. And Thomas More was a big fan, for instance, in time of Henry VIII. By the 1530s, his writings accounted for 10 to 20% of all book sales in Europe. 10 to 20%. I mean, that's kind of J.K. Rowling figures. Offered a professorship at Cambridge, but didn't like the weather or the wine. Also taught at Oxford and worked in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and France. A European all over, a humanist. Erasmus marks a change in attitudes towards learning, you write in your blog, Donald. Donald, what was that change?
Yeah, so here we have almost a synthesis of, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. It's called the Prince of Humanism, a humanist. What does that actually mean? Well, although he was a Catholic, he really was picking up on the flavors of the Reformation here. So the word, and this really is the foundation of this change in attitude towards learning. And Erasmus wrote many books on the topic of learning. So there's a lot of depth to Erasmus. He was a man who was constantly on the move, a pan-European figure. His books, as you say, were incredibly popular. He was a sort of bestseller, as it were, across Europe. And that's important. Starting with a sort of very simple, almost textbook called Adagia, which is 800 proverbs. They were in Latin, which is the downside. Nevertheless, they were typical of the sort of moral instruction that was around at that time. And then, of course, his very famous book, the one he's perhaps best known for, In Praise of Folly. It was written in the early 16th century, which is actually written in England. And it has a very English flavour to it. It mocks the Catholic Church, basically. It's full of satire. That whole thing about the abuses of the Catholic Church are there. He attacks monks and laymen and monasteries, the monastic tradition, and and also secular conceits. He has a go at both. So it's a wonderful figure here, a truly modern figure, post-Reformation figure, almost well ahead of his time. But for the purposes of this program today, I think it's important to concentrate on his contributions to schooling or learning. And so he writes Copia Foundations of the Abundant Style, which is, again, well, I think he was at Cambridge when he writes this. That's the first time he has a real deep dive into learning theory, because it sort of talks a lot about pedagogy and style. In other words, this is all about teaching and good teaching techniques. And this goes back to some of the figures we've already mentioned, the revelation that teachers should not be beating people into submission. And then with he has several other brilliant texts here, the right method of instruction, and another really good one on the education for children, which is, drawing out, it's an educare, a drawing out of knowledge, not a beating knowledge into people. And very practical stuff, like take notes. I still go to conferences, talk to 2,000 people, and hardly any of them's taking notes. And you go, you're learning professionals, you're going to forget all this. Why are you not doing what Erasmus recommended 500 years ago? And note-taking in your own words, always have a notebook on hand was, this is the sort of stuff he's coming to. A real detailed understanding of both teaching and learning. He's also very good on retrieval practice, curiously, and repetition. I mean, this is, hundreds of years before Ebbinghaus and modern theory on this, but he really does understand the nature of memory and describes memory, actually, and the retrieval practice and the importance of internal rehearsal, recalling things and repeating them with understanding, and using techniques like images, charts, and tables to understand knowledge, making it visual as well. Teaching yourself what you think you know in order to reinforce the learning and put it into long-term memory. He really understood the mechanisms of memory, which is interesting. And also, try teaching yourself. Try putting your own, what you think you know, to the test through teaching. Now, I think also in a really nice little book on the education for children, which he wrote a bit later, was all about the importance of play. Again, an incredibly contemporary topic. Getting away from this idea of punishment and so on. He was quite Platonic also in his view. He had a bit of a distrust of stories and fiction. He recommended that we didn't fall into this sort of sophistry, that sort of medieval scholastic tradition of, arguing endlessly about logical points. And he really didn't like the literature that was around then, the chivalric literature, myths of King Arthur. Remember, in England, he thought, do not show this to your children. This is a complete distraction. It'd be very unpopular amongst modern parents. He would have said, don't give your kids Harry Potter books. It's a waste of time for them. Focus on the importance of playing themselves and allowing children to be critical thinkers and understanding their own thinking.
If he was around now, he'd probably be criticizing computer games and
it probably would be as trivial, yeah.
TikTok and Twitter. There is always an educationalist, telling you that comics were rubbish or television or films, or they're going to rot your mind. So he brings that into it very early on, I suppose.
Yeah, and he writes books like this on the civility of children. He doesn't believe that children should just let rip with critical thinking. He thinks the teacher is really an important guide for a child. So that's a book on child behavior, actually, that he writes. And then another book called The Education of a Christian Prince, which is all about seeing the person as an individual. And this is what emerges importantly, which is why Illich thinks that this period is so important. We have the emphasis on the learner, not necessarily the teacher. That was, a revelation from the Reformation. And I think that's the healthy part of all this.
I think it's so interesting to see these three massive figures in the Reformation also so important for the shaping of modern education. And now we're going to add another with John Amos Comenius, 1592 to 1670. He was a Czech philosopher, pedagogue, and theologian who's considered the father of modern education. He served as the last bishop of the Unity of the Brethren before becoming a religious refugee and one of the earliest champions of universal education, a concept eventually set forth in his book Didactica Magna. As an educator and theologian, he led schools and advised governments across Protestant Europe through the middle of the 17th century. Donald, what's he add?
Right. I really love ending on this figure. I really love Comenius for the following reasons. He brings all this together. This is a guy who was hounded across Europe because, of course, in the post-Reformation figure that Europe was on fire. War was everywhere. The defenestration in Prague, 30 Years' War and so on. But he's this real bridge between the Reformation and the Enlightenment for me. A lover of the scientific revolution. And he brings in a very interesting, I think this really is almost Erasmus-like, a thing called pan-sophism. The idea of universal wisdom, a universal syllabus for everyone on the planet, rich or poor. So what is this unified? It's very particular, it's a unified system of education, but also a unified curriculum. Switching away from the classics. This is the important thing, to get away from Latin and the ancients towards a modern form of education. And he's a big believer in science. The scientific revolution is happening, and he writes a book called The Way of Light. This is written also in England, and he dedicates it to the Royal Society. In other words, he's a great admirer and thinks that science will be showing us the way, as indeed it did towards the Enlightenment. So you're switching away from the classics, and you're giving everyone universal access to learning and education, which was a big Lutheran and Calvinist feature. But you get that sense with him that this is a completely borderless idea, borderless education, that this is important. Education and schooling is important for the whole world, rich, poor. And he mentions this, male, female, rural, urban. He says everyone should have access to this because this is the future of humanity itself. He also mentions the disabled, all that inclusiveness that we take for granted these days didn't exist then on gender, the disabled, but he recommends this for everyone. So a really, contemporary figure in that sense. But, and here's the great contribution he makes really, out of printing, he writes the first ever textbooks. But they're an amazing thing. They're all available online and you can actually look at them, and they are wonderful things to read and look at. So The Doors of the Tongues Unlocked, which is written in the early 17th century, it's the first real teaching and textbook, like a little mini encyclopedia for kids. But it's one of the first textbooks to teach language by relating it to objects in the real world. So he has this sort of almost Aristotelian categories, animals in the farmyard, cows, hens, and so on. This became a bestseller. He was an absolute publishing sensation, Comenius. The idea was to lift education out of religious texts and scriptures and create its own literature, namely textbooks. Then his later attempt was even more amazing, I think called the Orbis Pictus, which was a picture book with text. So this is the first textbook to use pictures to illustrate the content and text, connecting words with things. And again, have a look at this book online. It's so amazing. So he starts in a very contemporary fashion with phonics, or the phonetics of a language, to teach language. That's when you open the book, that's the first thing you hit. He thought that was important because a child had to learn to read before they could understand the literature that he was about to present to them through textbooks. Then he goes into inanimate objects, and then through into animate objects, botany, zoology, and then through into religious and human activity and so on. Very structured. All in these beautiful woodcuts. Beautiful books, beautiful woodcuts. Gradually increasing the curriculum in terms of its complexity. So, later on, he then starts to really reflect on pedagogy in more detail, having written the textbook. So you have things like the Didactica Magna, which is a book, it's a bit like Rousseau, in a sense, and Emile and so on. He's starting to explore detailed pedagogies, what works, what doesn't work. And actually even comes up with a sort of schema, which we are now well aware of infant, secondary, primary, tertiary education. And the interesting thing about Comenius is that he was left fallow for centuries, really. He was only really rediscovered in the 19th century. because it was such a, when people were amazed when they started to fully understand his impact on taking printing from the Reformation, universal schooling from the Reformation, but turning it into a secular process of learning, something we do for all of our children now. So his vision, his pan-Sophic vision, has come to pass.
That's so interesting. We start by wondering, what do religious educators really have to add to? Well, they invented the textbook. No Comenius, no Dorling Kindersley, and so on. Whole industry built on the back of that invention, and he was the first. And also universal education. We take it for granted now that I think that everybody, pretty much everybody appreciates education as universal good. Almost no one would argue against that. But it had to be established as an important principle, and there it was.
Yeah.
So summing up, how should we think about the interdependence of religious faith and learning that we've seen in the work of this episode's thinkers? In an age like our own, when I think we tend to assume that these things are at loggerheads, don't we? Faith and learning.
Yes, I think that's right. And that's a mistake, because when you actually read the works by the people we have just described, you're often not sort of knocked off your chair by their contemporary ring. This is the point. But people think the Enlightenment was the big breakthrough, but actually it happened much earlier. Yeah. And these are the figures who this had to happen for the Enlightenment to take place. There is no Locke, Rousseau, Smith, Wollstonecraft, which we covered in another program. There is no Enlightenment without these figures, because you don't have that base of universal education across not only Europe but ultimately into the Americans and the rest of the world, without these figures having created the garden in which people could grow with textbooks, schooling, an enlightened view of motivation in the learner, the disintermediation, as it were, of learning from the structures of the church and even the state. I think they managed to create something truly, they're far more interesting, did things in far greater depth than most people imagine. We tend to fixate on Rousseau, for example. There is no Rousseau without these figures. And there's no, in a funny sort of way, many of these figures also rely on earlier scholars like the Arab scholarship we covered, and St. Augustine. This is a long story that goes back to the Greeks and the major religious figures, but we have these religious educators who were the bridge from that into the Enlightenment. But they were entities in themselves. They weren't just a bridge. They did really create universal schooling. It happened long before the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment just really, in a sense, turned it into a truly secular movement.
It's a very broad sweep that we've taken with this episode. Perhaps these origin stories are always interesting for that, because we're looking at things that happened quite a long time ago, relating them to our own time. But here we've kind of moved through a period of centuries. And it's made me think of a new category that I can use for my SEO in listing the great minds on learning. We're kind of perilously close to getting to intellectual history here, which I remember when I was at university was not a very well regarded discipline.
Well, that's right. I mean, although we are explicitly about learning theory in these programs, John, you can't disassociate that from the bedrock of the intellectual milieu in which all of these figures lived, wrote, and worked and lived. It emerged, learning theory as a sort of epiphenomenon that arose from that. That's what's interesting about these reflections. When we talk about it, you get that real feeling that it's linked to the philosophy and the politics of the day. It's not separate from it. Learning isn't some independent thing that only takes place in universities and schools. It's deeply rooted in the cultural phenomena and historical changes that take place beneath it.
And I think that's a great place to end. Thank you very much today, Donald. I've learned something. Which you'd always
I really enjoyed today's episode. It made me reflect a little bit on my own childhood, and of course you were brought up in a different tradition, but the conclusion is we surely all benefited from the learning we had as children, and that was a result of these pioneers way back then.
Yeah, perhaps not from the corporal punishment and the board rubber.
Definitely not.
Board rubber aimed with unerring accuracy at one's head by the maths teacher.
I can still remember the veins in my wrist being burst open by this thing called a TOS in Scotland, made in a place called Lochgelly, when I got 6th for the best, and I was completely blameless.
Yeah.
I got 6th of the best for being late for school because the bus was late.
Can
you believe?
Yeah. You kids, you don't know you're born. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. Sound edit is by Isaac Peacock. Social media by Jay Curtis. Graphics by David O'Connor. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we'd like to thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. If you're a fan of these podcasts and want to support us and get exclusive member benefits, go to patreon.com/learninghack.